Welcome to Question Mark, the podcast, exploring the greatest story ever told with open minds and open hearts.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show.
Well, hello everybody again. Welcome to Question Mark, the podcast. Today, I am absolutely delighted to welcome a good friend of mine of many years, a gentleman by the name of Luke Strickland. And I'm sure you will agree that by the end of this podcast, he is one of those most eloquent and interesting individuals you're ever likely to listen to. Luke, it's amazing to have you on the show. And can I just basically introduce you in a minimal way, and then invite you to tell us a little bit about yourself, just so that everyone knows. Luke is a podcaster, a musician. He's an athlete. He's a YouTuber. He's an author, and he's an all-round nice guy, as well as being a lot more handsome than me, which is a shame, but never mind. I'll forgive him that. Luke, welcome to the show. So I've just said, can you say a little bit more about yourself? That would be great if you could, just to introduce yourself for us, if you don't mind.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. Thanks so much, Steph. And that's certainly the best intro I've had for a long time. I guess I'm a bit of a polymath, I suppose. So I'm passionate about creativity in all its forms, and so that reel of things. So I started podcasting years ago. I still have a podcast with my family called Home Ed Matters, where we kind of explore how we're creative in our education at home, and then I've done some writing. You can find some books very reasonably priced on Amazon, which is actually about creativity and unlocking that. In my kind of career, I started as a professional engineer, and I still work in professional engineering consultancy. But these days, I'm a lot more focused around environmental sustainability and really how we can make better decisions. Actually, a lot of my role is about making environmental and sustainability issues more visible, but then also articulating about that. And so I feel like communication is one of the things that I'm passionate about.
Yeah.
All through my life, I've been singing, since the pushchair, really. So I've been leading worship in church for decades, and these days I share a lot of short songs on YouTube, often hymns, traditional hymns and things like that, but a real range. So if you go onto YouTube and search for Luke Strickland, you will find me there. But I'm just a big fan of friendship and good conversation, and so really delighted to contribute this evening.
That's fantastic. Yes, I would agree. You are indeed, Luke. And if I could pick the best possible kind of guest for Question Mark, it would be someone like you. I know is that you're a great conversationalist. So I'm hoping listeners and viewers, you're in for a treat this evening, or this afternoon, or whenever you're listening to this show. So without further ado, let's listen to the passage from Mark's Gospel, which is at the beginning of chapter 9, and it's going to be read for us by our good friend, Lucy Warner. Over to you, Lucy.
Mark chapter 9, verses 14 to 29, New International Version. Jesus heals a boy possessed by an impure spirit. When they came to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them, and the teachers of the law arguing with them. As soon as all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him. "What are you arguing with them about?" he asked. A man in the crowd answered, "Teacher, I brought you my son, who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not." "You unbelieving generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." So they brought him. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the boy's father, How long has he been like this? From childhood, he answered. It has often thrown him into fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. If you can, said Jesus, everything is possible for one who believes. Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. When Jesus saw that a crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the impure spirit. You deaf and mute spirit, he said, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. The spirit shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. The boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, He's dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. After Jesus had gone indoors, his disciples asked him privately, Why couldn't we drive it out? He replied, This kind can come out only by prayer.
Thanks very much again, Lucy. So I often say this about Mark's Gospel and the passages that we've done, but here it is again. This is one of those passages which begs so many questions. I thought, as an actor, having done this performance so many times, I knew the story. But the more I look at it, the more questions I have. And I know I'm not the only one. We've had a lot of questions coming through from our listeners about this particular passage. And Luke, since that's our job, really, to kind of discuss what these things might mean. I'll just relay a few of the things that people have raised. For instance, several have been wondering about why it was that when the people saw Jesus as he came down the mountain, they were so overwhelmed with wonder. And what's that all about, that they ran to greet him? What's it mean when Jesus says, Oh, unbelieving generation? Who's he talking about? Is he talking about the crowd? Is he talking about the disciples? Is he talking about the scribes, the teachers of the law who were arguing with the disciples? And there's all this stuff, isn't there, about why the disciples couldn't drive out the spirit from the boy. It's not really clearly explained. There's all sorts of mysteries, I think, about this passage. And I'll be honest, I found this really hard myself to think about as a result. But Luke, I mean, as you look at the passage yourself, what are your first thoughts? What are your kind of main impressions?
It's literally at the bottom of the mountain, isn't it? So, it's coming off the back of the Transfiguration, which is this mountaintop experience. And it feels like this passage is it's about the gritty reality of relationship with Jesus on the ground. And I think just from that perspective, there's loads really to chew over, because, talk about grounding from this amazing experience in the previous chapter to an argument, borderline fight of something really confusing. And isn't it interesting how the disciples are silent all the way till the very end? Yeah. And that silence speaks volumes to me. So yeah, indeed. I think it's just this gritty, earthy, we live in a messy world, and this is this really messy scene, and I love it for that.
That's a wonderful thought. I can't wait to hear some of that being explored a bit more in a few moments, Luke. That sounds really amazing. For myself, I would say, well, I had a bit of a strange experience. You know that I rang you a couple of hours ago and said, Luke, I just can't get my head around this passage. And I'd spent all afternoon trying to get my kind of ideas together, and it was proving to be a complete washout. And right at the end, just after I phoned you, Luke, and you reassured me, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. I asked myself, hold on, have I actually prayed about reading and this passage and the podcast? And I thought, no, I actually haven't. I've taken the kind of lazy, more kind of I can do it myself approach to the Christian life, which is often the case, I have to confess, I'm sad to say. And then I thought, I think this is what my personal view is, that the disciples were going through. Jesus says to them at the end, they ask him, why couldn't we drive it out? And in fact, the word why it's interesting, because in the Greek it's more like why couldn't we drive it out? They're affronted by the fact they haven't been able to drive out the spirit. And Jesus says to them, this kind can come out only by prayer. Guys, you think you can do it under your own steam. I know I've given you authority to drive out demons, but you have to have a relationship with the Father. And I thought, how ironic that in my own limited way, I've had the same sort of experience. I mean, just to say, before we get into the passage in general, I think for me, the main point is, and I could be completely wrong here. I think we'll have some interesting points of dialogue and comparison, but also perhaps some contrast as well. But my main thing about this is it follows through in a theme, I think, in the whole of Mark's gospel, which is it's all about faith. I agree with what you were saying earlier. It's about faith, but it's about faith in what God is doing, not just in the story, but what God is doing now and has started. And the story is the beginning of that process. Whatever God is up to, do we believe it? Do we believe that he is doing what he says he's doing? And it goes back to the first word, the first time believe comes up in the story, I think is in chapter 1, verse 14 and 15. Jesus says, the kingdom of God has arrived. Repent, change your thinking, and believe the good news. That, for me, is what this story is about. Now, whether I'm going to be able to prove it is another matter. And as I say, it'll be interesting to hear all the other perspectives that we're going to come up with. There you go.
Wow,
so, Luke,
yeah. this kind of episode can only be produced through prayer. That's the message, is it? The translation, verse 29.
Yes, I hadn't read it that way, but yes, exactly. But yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? How God can kind of meet us in our inadequacy and in our confusion, in our self-sufficiency. And I think that's a lesson he's constantly teaching us, I suspect.
It's interesting, we talk about question mark, you talk about the questions that had come up from other listeners, and some really challenging ones there. And it made me just think, Jesus asks more questions in this passage, I think, than anybody else. He's asking these questions. How long has he been like this?
Yeah.
What are you arguing about?
Yeah.
How long? Why? Jesus asks a lot of questions there. Yeah. And it feels out of character, perhaps, or it feels uncomfortable. I felt uncomfortable when I was reading his the way that he navigates it, because we're so used to, maybe we hone in on those passages where Jesus serenely walks through stuff. So literally, he passes through the crowd, doesn't he? When they're picking up their stones to throw him, and he passes through the crowd. And yet at other times he's upsetting the tables and turning over the temple. And this feels somewhere in between. But then I also thought, I read into it that Jesus is angry, and I don't know if that's there, because he's just asking questions. And
good point.
So in my head, I'm thinking he's saying, how unbelieving you all are. But he could just be going, there could be sorrow. So, yes. I feel an echo of when he's saying, I weep for you, Jerusalem. Is there sorrow here? Gosh. And it's just that it's so interesting that we hear God in a different way here. We've heard God in the previous section, a voice from heaven, and we hear what we hear then, because Jesus is the perfect representation of God here, and he is transfigured in the previous section, and the select disciples have seen him like that, and now we hear God speak in a different way, and it's uncomfortable, but it's also really grounded. How long has he been like this? What's going on? I love that interest.
Quite practical. Yes, that's fascinating. It's interest, isn't it? It's showing interest. It's almost like a sense of his compassion for the individual. I think that's one of the questions that came up, actually. A young lady wrote in and said, is Jesus showing compassion for the man by asking that question? And I think it's a fascinating point, isn't it?
I mean, he didn't have to,
no,
did he? So what I find another thing, there's so many interesting things here. So the last healing that we read about in Mark, Jesus touches someone's eyes. And there's other stories in the Gospels where who touched me, and there's no dialogue necessarily related to his healing power, and yet in this one he talks. We know that Jesus is the Word of God, and here he is talking. He's like a doctor diagnosing the thing. And then it's not the power of his touch that causes the healing here. The touch comes after. Is the command of his voice. He commands it, and it's only afterwards when they're going, oh, I think he's killed him and the boy's dead, that he touches him and he lifts him up. And I just find that absolutely fascinating, that we hear God in a different way here, but also there is that just like that humanity, that connection, and that is a different side of it, isn't it, to the divinity that was up the mountain. And I guess it's possible to relate to God. It's appropriate to relate to God in both spaces.
Does that
but where do we live most of our life?
Go on, tell us more.
Well, on the ground.
On the ground.
We're not up in the clouds, are we, all the time?
No. So we can relate to the human side here of Jesus. I love that idea. From what you're telling me, you're suggesting that the being up the mountain is one kind of existence, being down on the ground is another, and Jesus, translates into both. In other words, he's both God and man, and fully God and fully man, and he can therefore relate to us in our circumstances. Is that something about
I think so, because I think my first notes on this were really about representation. So when Jesus is up the mountain, he's perfectly representing God. They're seeing him on he's glowing. Then on the ground, we meet humanity, and we're made in God's image. And what is humanity doing? It's arguing. Right? It's, imperfectly representing God's image. And then we see a child who is unwell, and I understand from that, the society at the time, that that was deemed as some kind of flaw, and yet children, Jesus later says, let them come to me, you must be like a child. There's something about the way that children reflect God's image, and yet this is a broken child, a broken image, and there's these fractures all the way through. The perfect image of God engaging with humanity, a group of people made in the image of God but not representing God well, and then a child who is there's I think there other readings into it might be, well, whose fault was that? Because if there was this belief that it was sin that caused physical or mental illness, so something about representation there, that we could draw from, I think.
That's fascinating. So there is a sense here, Luke, don't get me, correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but you're seeing something symbolic at work. Would that be fair to say? When you say representation, it's more than just the story.
I think it is. I think it is. I mean, there's more than one layer to it. Perhaps what I'm seeing, and you can see it in symbolism is so powerful all through the Bible, isn't it? And I guess I perhaps am often drawn to the literal, what's actually happening. But somehow I've managed, as I've focused on this, to see some of the what is it representing here. So that's something symbolic.
I love that. Now, listen, I think I have to confess to you that that's beginning to be the way I read Mark's gospel generally, because I think there are layers. I think you're absolutely right that there is this literal level, this kind of factual level. This is what happened. We can trust, I hope, that Mark is faithfully recording the facts. What he's doing is writing 30 or 40 years after, isn't he? And, eyewitnesses of this would have been speaking to him. People alive at the time would have been there listening to this story being told by him. So, he's bound to get the information right. But there's another level, which is how he's using it, what he's attempting to do with it. And, your idea about the representation of the divine and the human, it works brilliantly for me. I also think, though, that there is running through Mark another symbol, if you like, or maybe it's connected actually with what you're saying. It's about, even it's about faith. It's about faith, actually. This story, on a literal level, is about faith. I think we agree. And it from a literal point of view, it's really challenging, isn't it? And I don't know about you, but for me, I really relate to that man who says, if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. And then Jesus says, yeah, if you can, anyone who has what's he say? I got to get it right. Everything is possible for him who believes. And then the man says, I do believe, help me. It's not clear cut belief. I do relate with that. And there are all sorts of other human elements to the story which make us feel, yeah, this is about us. This is about our journey. But from a symbolic point of view, I have to say, I believe, using that word advisedly, there's something far richer going on. And as I was saying to you just before we came on air, the first time the word believe is mentioned in this gospel is chapter 1, verse 14 and 15. And Jesus talks about the reign of God, the rule of God, the regime of God has arrived. The kingdom of God has arrived. And he says, change your thinking, repent, and believe the good news. And for me, this is what this story is about. At the end of the day, what I think is going on, Mark's trying to impress upon us a big question. Are you going to believe? Now, Luke, you're probably going to ask me, please ask me. I don't want to keep talking unnecessarily, but how do I know all that? And
how do you know all that?
Thank you. I'm glad you butted in. So I'm going to take a leap out there, and I'm going to say, for me, the two sections of this story that really stand out in that respect are when in verse 19, Jesus says, "Oh, unbelieving generation, how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." Here is a question for you, Luke, and it's for me as well, and for all the listeners. Why does Jesus why does he call whoever he's talking to, and that's a question in its own right, why does he call them a generation? So I'm going to leave that hanging for a minute. And the other main section is what happens with the boy. And this is how I know this passage has got to be symbolic. Because it says here, the boy looked so much like a corpse that many said he's dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. And it's those phrases about death and life, because the words in Greek about lifting him to his feet and standing up are the same words used to describe Jesus's resurrection, standing up out of the dead. There's something really powerful going on beyond the literal, is what I'm saying. And that's what I'd love to explore later on in this podcast, hopefully, if we have time. What are your thoughts, or any extra thoughts you have?
I mean, it's cinematic, isn't it? And you have, in a sense, when some of these things because you have literally breathed this story out as you have acted it out, and you've dramatized it, haven't you? And and that symbolism, reminds me of, I'm a huge fan of great storytelling on screen, whether it's the small screen or the big screen. And, there's some really great, really great series out there. I'm not going to name drop any, but what I find fascinating is the symbolism. They use camera shots really well. They use mirroring really well. All of these things. It's like, oh yeah, this person's literally going down lower because he's lost his status. And there's a cinematic sense to Mark's gospel, isn't there?
Yes,
that we see all of that. I mean, do you know what? Something that they're silent about. Why were the Pharisees arguing with the disciples? And I get the sense that they tried. So Like there's other times that the disciples haven't really tried, right? And I imagine that the Pharisees hadn't tried. They were just pointing and jeering, unless the Pharisees had tried too, maybe not. But isn't it interesting that, I asked your disciples to drive the spirit out, but they could not. But, that he didn't say they did not. And I applaud the disciples for trying.
Yeah.
But the faith that we're drawn to is this imperfect, half-formed faith of the Father, in the boy's father here. And I identify with it. Like, I know, gosh, Lord, I know. I believe in my head you can do all of these. You can do all things. Yeah, I believe that in my head. I'm not sure I've got enough faith in the day-to-day. And yet the disciples were the ones. What I like here is it's possible, therefore, to be a close follower of Jesus and not have enough faith.
Exactly.
Because that's what Jesus says at the end. Like, oh yeah, and not to get it right, whatever.
Yeah.
And isn't that really freeing that we can be closely associated with Jesus, but we can also. There's the counterpoint there of, this man's brought his son with a problem, those panic prayers. Oh gosh, please help me, God, with these things today, with this meeting at work or whatever. Please unlock this situation. And God, like Jesus, when we are walking with Jesus, we can do both. We can walk with him and we can come to him with the problem. And, it's funny how that gets wrapped up in this story. You can read that into it as well. And really liberating, because none of us are perfect, are we?
No, that's
we are.
right.
Are we still the unbelieving generation?
Indeed, exactly. And so that's a challenge as well as a comfort, isn't it? Because the story of Mark is about people who are not completely formed. The disciples are not heroes. They're actually a lot of the time idiots. And so we can gain comfort. But the other point from what you're saying is, of course, Jesus isn't going to let them rest there, is he? And so is it possible to think at one point we can say, yeah, we're human, but we can't be complacent, and certainly God won't let us be. Would that be fair?
I think so, because all through Mark, he's literally taking his disciples on a journey. They go from here to Galilee. That they are moving. He's been up and down a mountain, and yet they're also on a spiritual journey, aren't they? And on a character journey in their hearts. And I wonder this thing about this line, well, only prayer can drive this kind out.
Yeah.
Is that to do with the connection again? So it's like, actually, the disciples just weren't. It's not some magic words.
Yeah.
It's not that God's power isn't enough, but it's connection.
Yes.
And they were disconnected from Jesus because Jesus was up the mountain. It was only when Jesus came back that he showed them the connection, how the connection was made to a certain extent.
I wonder whether the connection is with the Father, because Jesus was modeling, or at least we see Jesus at prayer, don't we, to his Father in earlier sections of this gospel. And I just wonder whether it's about why they couldn't do it is because they just didn't have the faith, because they didn't have that connection with God, not necessarily specifically with Jesus because he's up the mountain. Personally, I don't see that, but because they just didn't decide to pray. And rather like me, in the story I was telling earlier, I get the feeling these guys are quite arrogant. After all, they've been picked out, 12 people, to be the new Israel. And they'd been given authority by Jesus in chapter 3. And my goodness, we're great, aren't we? We can do it all by ourselves. When actually, in fact, that is hardly the case. They need that connection with God, just like Jesus did.
Do you think, because these were the disciples that weren't picked to go up the mountain, though, as well. And so do you think there was a sense of, well, we'll show them, I'll get picked next time because I can sort this out.
There could be, they are arrogant. Why I know they're arrogant is there's a little line back in chapter 6, just before the feeding of the 5,000. And they come to Jesus and they tell him about all the things they had done and taught. There's kind of this enthusiasm, no doubt, but it's all about me. It's not about the fact that they're working in tandem with Jesus or with God. It's about what we have done, what I have done. There's a little bit of crazy power hunger going on with these disciples. So I believe that's probably likely what you're describing. Can I return to my main theme though, Luke? Would that be possible?
Go for it.
I just wonder. This is what I'm going to say, and as I say, I could be completely wrong. I would also have to be honest that the sources for what I'm about to say, I hope I'm going to represent them well, are a couple of writers. One called John Burnett, who's a friend of mine, who's a brilliant scholar on Mark's Gospel. Another called Ched Myers. I don't know if you've ever read that book called Binding the Strong Man. I would recommend it, Luke, if you can get it. It's absolutely amazing. And if you're listening to the show, you've not read it. It is very different to your typical kind of evangelical approach. But it's a political reading of Mark's Gospel. I wouldn't personally espouse everything that's written there, but it is fascinating how much depth he goes into. Anyway, these two guys, I think, have influenced me to some extent, and I'm hoping the Holy Spirit has as well. I just wonder what Mark is doing beneath the words, beneath the literal level. You see, there's a pattern in Mark's Gospel, and one of the patterns that come up, there are loads of them, but one of the patterns that come up at this point is the following. Jesus tells his disciples he's going to die, the Son of Man is going to die and rise again. The disciples don't understand it or challenge him. Jesus explains to the disciples privately, and then finally Jesus explains to the crowd. And that happens 4 times in this section of the gospel. This is the 3rd time, I believe, this happens. Jesus is up the mountain, and one of the things he does on the way down, he says, the Son of Man is going to be raised from the dead. And he's just saying the same thing again. The disciples don't understand him there. Peter, James, and John, they don't understand him as they come down the mountain. And now he's coming to the whole disciples. And instead of teaching everybody, as he normally would do, it's almost like a story is telling us what the meaning is of what he's saying. How do I explain that? Okay, so as I said earlier, the questions for me surround those 2 quotes about, "O generation without trust," literally in the Greek, or this unbelieving generation, and the bit about the boy being picked up. Why does Mark talk about generation when it's just about a few people? He's not talking about, that there's not a whole generation of people. The reason why Mark's talking about a generation is because Jesus as well is talking about a generation of people. Are they going to believe what Jesus says about himself and about what God is doing? And I have to confess at this point, I struggle to believe this. I sometimes wonder whether I'm a real Christian, Luke, because if what I'm about to say is true, then I'm having a big problem. And I'm going to be like that man. I'm going to be saying, I do believe God, but my goodness, help me in my unbelief. Because what I understand Mark's Gospel to be saying, what I understand the whole process of the story is that God has started something new in Jesus. And all the destruction, all the death, all the evil that has plagued mankind from the beginning of his existence has now begun to be reversed. And God, through Jesus, is creating a new world and a new heaven. And the beginning of that story is this story. And the story is going to continue until the end of the age. That's what Mark's Gospel is about. And the resurrection of Jesus and the death of Jesus, they are both fundamental to that story. What looks like a disaster, the death of Jesus, ends up being a triumph, because in the resurrection, Jesus destroys death. And death is the thing that's our worst enemy. That's human beings. Death is our worst enemy, not just in the physical sense, but in the spiritual sense and in all sorts of other senses. decay, destruction, disease, sin, animosity, all the squabbling we were talking about earlier, arguments, that's all deathly. Jesus has come to change all that. In other words, to make everything new, to restore it to what it was once when God first created it. And the challenge for me and you, the challenge for me definitely, do I believe it? Because if the story is true, Jesus has started it and it's carrying on right now as we speak, and it's going to end one day in absolute brilliant, the realization. But I don't know about you, but I look at the news, I read the news, and I watch the news, and I think this world is going down the pan. I mean, it's so full of violence and evil and destruction. Where is God in this? Where is he? And this story seems to be saying, God's around. He started something. He started it, and it's going to happen one day. Believe it. That's the point. Do you have belief or not?
Really powerfully articulated. And I think, that hope that's there, because when we can look around and feel hopeless, I certainly, like you, I look at the news, we lurch from crisis to crisis. I'm acutely aware of the environmental crisis, but we read about the new heaven and the new earth, but we've also got to be responsible in the meantime. I think, I love that. I think if you're questioning your faith, the depth of your faith, that's probably a healthy place to be, rather than where the disciples were, in that kind of hubris. And also what do the Pharisees symbolize? The priesthood at the time, is all the way through. It had become a shell. It was disconnected, and yet this is all about connection. That I agree with you that there are patterns here, and that Jesus. Somebody coming with a crisis and Jesus restoring that crisis, Jesus bringing life is so encouraging. And Jesus can still do that when we bring our complex messes to him. I love I think the Father here had some faith because he brought his son and he spoke the truth. Jesus asked him questions and he said, well, this is what's happening. I find that really grounding. I also think, mercy triumphs over judgment. And we read that, that's an echo in the rest of the Bible. And we see that here where Jesus is merciful, or we see this repeat. That's a pattern we see repeated. Jesus is mercy rather than judgment. You are a sinner. What did you do wrong? This is generational sin that we hear in other things. Who sinned in this case? Was it the father or we don't hear that. No. Jesus just says, bring the boy to me. And speaks, and I take great hope that Jesus can speak into our situations and into our political situations, into our systems, but also into ourselves.
Absolutely.
That's that the power of Jesus's command brings hope, and if for those that will hear it, and we hear a lot of from Jesus here, and I, the Spirit in the boy heard it, but did the disciples, did the unbelieving generation hear it? Do you and I hear it? That clarion call. I find that really hard, because I think sometimes I'm not even bringing my imperfect situations to Jesus. I'm not even halfway up the mountain. I'm not astonished to see Jesus. Maybe I am astonished to see Jesus because it's a surprise that I'm reminded that he's walking with me. I worry that I'm not even in here. Where am I? Well, I'm somewhere else. I'm busy going through the motions. And I think it's okay to feel like that, but it's also okay to ask. The Father saying, I brought my son to you. His most precious. I mean, how many stories in the Bible are about that precious relationship between a father and a son? And is there an echo of the Father saying, I've given my son to you.
Yeah, maybe.
There's something there. Jesus is just, Father God up the mountain has just declared something, and we meet an imperfect father, a beloved son. Yeah.
That's fascinating. And I love the way you brought it back to the personal, and you've actually rounded it together by saying it's all about, for me, what you've said is it's all about transformation. It's all about what God can do for the personal, the individual, for families, for situations in our lives, but also in systems, as you say, in all that's apparently wrong and messy and in trouble. And we've got to ask, and we've got to ask with faith.
Yeah, I think so. And to listen for that, and to receive those words. But whether we're asking privately, indoors with Jesus, or whether we are in the midst of an argument, taking action is important here, and there is action. There's action all the way through this, isn't there?
Absolutely. Luke, it's been absolutely amazing to talk with you this evening, and I'm so grateful you could come on the show. Have you enjoyed it?
I have. It's been a delight. I feel like we could go on and on.
Yes.
So, like, where's the time gone? But I also, I'm delighted that I'm coming away with that renewed sense of hope and challenge. And isn't that the point of the Bible reading us as well? Amen. That you come away with that hope and challenge. So yeah, thank you so much, and I really hope it's been a blessing to all those who connect with this in any way.
Absolutely. That's my prayer too. Thank you again, Luke Strickland, and look forward to seeing you again in another way sometime soon. Bless you, man.
Definitely. Thanks so much, Steph.
All the best.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.
If you enjoyed this episode of Question Mark and don't want to miss any future episodes, be sure to click on the subscribe button. This also means other people can find the podcast and join the conversation too. We'd also love if you could leave a review so we know what was good and what we can improve for future episodes. If you want to find out more about I Am Mark, Stephen Smart's solo word-for-word dramatisation of Mark's Gospel, go to www.sleek.bio/IamMark, where you can sign up for free for his newsletter and a whole host of other goodies. Join us and our special guests next time, where we'll continue to explore the greatest story ever told together. If you want to get involved with the podcast or have any questions or comments in the meantime, please do get in touch using the I Am Mark social media channels. We'd love to hear from you.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. And this is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. And this is the greatest show.